Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one we see the Russians have managed to advance further across the Oskil River line, managed to advance further near Nadia along the Serbets River line. They've expanded their foothold across the Serbets River line near Ivanivka. The Russians have also managed to advance west of Pokrovsk, in the northern flank of Kharkiv and in the southern flank of the city, as well as in the direction of Velyka Novosilka within the town itself, where the encirclement of Ukrainian forces continues, and the Ukrainian forces are facing extremely difficult battles to just have a few of their soldiers survive from the siege. Starting out in the southern direction, the Russians have continued their siege of Velyka Novosilka, where they are continuing the battles within the town itself. The Russians are expanding their foothold in the eastern parts of the town, looking to completely cut off the southern parts. I'm not drawing all this into a gray zone because the Ukrainian forces have withdrawn from the southern parts of Velyka Novosilka, but simply because they do not control it anymore due to the small gap in between the Russian forces and their complete encirclement of the area, which means that the Ukrainians simply are unable to call this under their control. Instead, the Ukrainian forces are here suffering enormous casualties due to the Russian encirclement, and the Ukrainians are having a very difficult time trying to withdraw from the town as the Russian positions within Remivka have been dug in. The Ukrainians are unable to push them out, and the Russians have a wide control over the road. This means that the best opportunity the Ukrainians would have would be a direct assault towards Remivka from the high ground. But even that is very difficult due to the Russian drone coverage and artillery coverage of their forces within town, and therefore the Ukrainians simply do not have the capabilities to launch a proper counterattack without expending too much forces, which would negate any gains they would have from saving their forces from encirclement, and it is not in line with how Syrskyi operates. Syrskyi is simply not the person who breaks out encircled forces, and that is what we have seen from his now almost a year of being the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces. What we see is going to be just one of many more encirclements the Russians will conduct, which will speed up the casualty rate at which the Ukrainians take casualties, and therefore the weakening of the Ukrainian armed forces will speed up. At the same time, here in the south of Kharkiv, the Russians have managed to advance slightly further north of the Yantarne, where they are aligning front line along the forest lines, along the road towards Dashne. This is a slow advance, this is a simple advance, as the Russians develop their offensive operations towards Dashne from the south. The Russians have also managed to advance here near Yasinovo and Novandrivka, following the capture of the forest lines to the south. The Russians are moving up in a northern direction. This has allowed the Russians to capture the southern half of Novandrivka and push the Ukrainians to the northern half of the town, likely leading to further offensive operations by the Russians on the northern side as well, and further pushes towards Sribne along the forest lines to the south and towards the town directly from the east, with additional operations from the north, which would be attacking Sribne from 3 directions. While we're currently seeing attacks also on Novandrivka from 2 directions, they'll likely expand for the Russians to gain control over the forest lines in the north. The Russians have also managed to advance further west of Pokrovsk, gaining control over some of the areas near Kotliny, launching operations towards the next defensive outposts of the Ukrainians north of the town to secure their control over the highway for further offensive operations towards the city itself, and also to develop offensive operations towards Udashne and in the general area, gaining further control over the highway between Pokrovsk and Zaporizhia, to develop offensive operations towards gaining control over the railway intersection towards Dnipro as well. This will significantly improve the Russian positions west of Pokrovsk by limiting the supplies that the Ukrainians are able to send through both of these railways, and to be able to have a secure supply road for themselves to the Battle of Pokrovsk. The Russians have made several advances here in the eastern section of the front line, but in this update the most significant ones are in the northern section of the front line. The Russians have made several advances west of the Serbets River line, getting control over Belorivka and the surrounding fortified positions. An interesting part is that the Ukrainians had 3 defensive positions pointing in the eastern direction to secure the Serbets River line, one to the south of Ivanivka, one to the north of Ivanivka, and one within Mirne along the Serbs river line. These three defensive positions were supposed to prevent a Russian bridgehead across the Serbs river line and prevent the Russian forces from expanding such a bridgehead. Instead, the Russians managed to pass through, gain control over the northern parts of Ivanivka, gain control over the fortified positions pointing towards the Serbs river line, expanding the zone of control and increasing the crossings they had available across the Serbs river line. This allowed them to flank the fortified positions near Bilorivka, pointing in the southern direction, which then allows them to flank the fortified positions along Mirne, pointing in the eastern direction. At the same time, they've managed to gain control over several of the fortified positions northeast of Liman, which weren't properly manned because they were not expecting Russian forces to cross over, and they did not react fast enough. This has led to several advances by the Russians, taking advantage of these exposed positions. The following fortified positions were properly manned, and this has made it more difficult for the Russians to expand further, but they are slowly gaining more and more control over the western bank of the Serbs river line, where the Russians are looking to gain control over the defensive lines of the Ukrainians, cutting off the supply lines, improving their own bridgehead by expanding it, allowing for more supplies to go over and more areas to be covered by the Russian infantry and vehicles. This is allowing the Russians to slowly advance and expand their bridgehead and improve their positions northeast of Liman as the Russians continue their offensive operations towards the Oskil River line. The Russians have also managed to expand their positions west of Nadia following the capture of the village. The Russians now fighting along their forest lines towards the western parts to connect all the way upwards toward Kopenki in the west. The Russians have also managed to expand their foothold across the Oskil River line, where the bridgehead is expanding bit by bit. The Russians have captured the forest patch north of Zapatne. They've managed to advance towards the forest lines in between the town of Devarishna and Zapatne, where they are looking to gain control over the highway itself, allowing for better supply lines towards Zapatne and further on Kupiansk, and also gaining control over the forest lines, allow for a buffer zone between the highway and the Ukrainian forces as the Russians look to expand their foothold further. The Russian bridgehead across the Oskil River line has grown significantly over the past few weeks. The Russians gained control over the majority of the Varishna, leaving only one single district of the town under Ukrainian control, the Bitvarki district. The Russians are slowly expanding their zone of control along the highway in between the Varishna and Zapatne. This will allow for the Russians to move through a paved road, a paved highway that is properly maintained. This will allow for quicker and more sustainable supplies going through from the eastern parts near the Varishna into the Varishna and then onwards towards Zapatne, having a secure supply line there. The Russians would need to gain control further north to secure the northern flank of this highway and to secure the positions on the western bank of the Oskil River line, gaining control of Bitvarki as well the remaining parts. This will allow for further offensive operations towards Zapatne and further down south towards Kupiansk, but also allowing them to launch further offensive operations in the northern direction in the Kharkiv region. What we previously saw is a smaller incursion just to redirect Ukrainian forces has now turned into a larger operation due to the refusal of the Ukrainians to send proper reinforcements to deal with these Russian forces. The Russians found a gap in the Ukrainian defenses and exploited it. The Ukrainians did not have enough forces to respond to it due to their Kursk incursion, due to their spreading out their forces thinly across the front line, and this allowed the Russians to make a lot out of something which was an extremely difficult operation at the start, because it is a offensive over the Oskil River line against prepared Ukrainian positions on the high ground, and this made it very difficult. However, the Russians managed to succeed regardless of that, allowing for significant developments across the Oskil River line. The Russians now control the majority of the Varishna, as well as several forest patches and forest lines, and this has allowed them to concentrate more and more forces across the Oskil River line, and this is allowing them to develop offensive operations. The Ukrainians would be smart to launch a counteroffensive to completely kick out the Russians from the Oskil River line, the western bank of it. This will secure their positions here along the Oskil River line for the next few weeks or even months. However, the Ukrainians do not have the necessary forces to do that, just as they do not have the necessary forces to release the encirclement of Velyka Novosilka. Something else that's interesting is that now that Trump is in office, it is his policy that runs the Ukraine war for the United States. And what he said yesterday on live television from a journalist asking him about the Ukraine war, he said that the pressure he wants to exert on the Russians, if they do not want to negotiate, is that they'll increase tariffs, they'll increase the sanctions, they'll make more and more economic pressure on the Russians, and they'll increase aid to Ukraine. This means that the Russians would be facing a stronger opponent and more pressure on their economy if they do not negotiate on Trump's terms. In the case of the Ukrainians who are unwilling to negotiate, then Trump would instead limit the supplies, limit the weapons sent to Ukraine, limit the aid sent to Ukraine, or completely disregarding it, completely making it non-existent if they do not negotiate on Trump's terms. And then Trump wants now to speak both to Zelensky and to Putin. He's already spoken to Zelensky prior to his enter into office. Now he's trying to set up a conversation with Putin, likely to get his perspective, to get his thoughts on the situation, and then take his decision thereof. So far, it seems that the information he has is entirely based on his own advisors and Western intelligence, and has no regard for the Russian perspective and the Russian intelligence, where anyone who has been on Telegram for more than 5 minutes understands that what he's saying about the Russians having 1 million KIA and the Ukrainians having 700,000 KIA is simply bogus and not rooted in reality. I don't know who is advising him and with regards to the Ukraine war, but if anyone who advises Trump or Trump himself watches this, you have to understand the Russians have had such a significant advantage despite all the Western support to Ukraine, based on the fact that the Russians have not really needed to do much of a mobilization. They initially mobilized 300,000 people. This allowed them to have the majority of the armed forces to be volunteers, regardless of their intention. They went there on their own behalf, and therefore the majority of them would have higher morale than the majority of the Ukrainian armed forces by far being mobilized. At the same time, the Ukrainians have had a continuous mobilization since the start of the war until now, and they constantly complain about the lack of manpower. This clearly shows that whatever they're mobilizing is not filling the ranks properly, either because they are mobilizing at a pace that is slower than what the losses they are taking is, or because that the Ukrainian soldiers are simply not being sent to the front. In either case, this means that the Ukrainians' armed forces at the front line are not sufficient. The initial Ukrainian army was 200,000 active soldiers and 500,000 territorial defense, and on top of that, there's been a mobilization. According to Zelensky, there's currently 800,000 soldiers on the front line. That means over almost 3 years of mobilization, there's been an increase of 100,000 soldiers. This means that every single person, except for the 100,000 who has been mobilized, would be counted as a casualty that is irrecoverable. Either because they were too wounded to return, that they were simply ended their contract, they were sent back home, which is not the case because they complain about the lack of exactly that. This means that the majority of those forces were either KIA or wounded too harshly to return to the front line. And based on that, we can determine that the Ukrainian casualties are ginormous. In turn, the Russians initially fought with between 120 to 200,000 soldiers. Let's take the upper end, 200,000. The Russians did a partial mobilization of 300,000 soldiers. Wagner took about 50,000 casualties, according to Prigozhin himself, throughout this conflict. And then we have seen a constant volunteer program for the Russians over the past 2 years, in which the Russians have been recruiting about 400,000 a year. That is 800,000 with the 200,000. That is 1 million. Yet we see reports that it's somewhere between 600 and 700,000 soldiers at the front line. Let's say 700,000 because that's the most recent one. And based on that, we can see that the Russians would have taken 300,000 casualties plus 50,000 Wagner. Let's say 400,000 irrecoverable casualties, as well as people whose contracts have ended and so on. Therefore, we can see that the Ukrainians would have significantly higher casualties than the Russians, and realistically speaking, the Russians would not have more than 400,000 irrecoverable casualties. So your estimate is 2.5 times higher than the cap. That is just how unrealistic that estimate is. So whoever told you that, fire him. He's useless, completely bogus. You could hire me instead. Who knows? Anyways, that is all from the publicly available information. You can look it up, you can Google it. Anyone with 2 brain cells can figure this out. Of course, you're very busy, so you can get your advisors to Google it. And if they actually accept the truth when it's in front of their eyes, then you can keep them. You don't have to fire them. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.